Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we'll be exploring what awakening or enlightenment specifically is. Many of us believe if we sit in meditation or take up yoga or find that perfect teacher that's going to show us the way out of suffering, that perhaps most of our problems will be solved. We'll discover today that in the enlightenment of being able to try to achieve such enlightenment or awakening, that what you'll need to probably find yourself doing is more direct self-inquiry to look at the limitations that once seemed to define who you are and discover to be more like transparent lines that are drawn on water. On the program today, we'll be joined by Eli Jaxon-Bear. His book is Sudden Awakening. Stop your mind, open your heart, and discover your true nature. Eli, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. I'm glad to have you, and thank you for having me on.
Now, this has been quite a journey for you, and this is quite a book. Tell us about how this all started for you.
Well, that would take the whole program.
Well, you know, that's sometimes what happens when you have direct inquiry.
You know, how did it all start? You know, it started, I'd say, when I was 18 years old, and a phone call came in that a bus was going to Alabama with SNCC as part of the what's now known as the Selma to Montgomery March. Before that was happening, when there was demonstrations and people being beaten. I was 18 years old. I was a freshman in college, and I knew I was on the bus. And a Reverend Reeb, a white man, had just been beaten to death in Selma. The nightly news showed the police putting dogs and fire hoses on the marchers. And I just knew I had to be there. And I got on the bus, and it changed my life. And I haven't gotten off the bus since.
Now, it's interesting, too, because this was also during a time that you were considered to be a fugitive because of the Vietnam War. Is that true?
Well, I got on the bus in civil rights in 65, and that just kept going. That led me to I was in Chicago in 68 during the Democratic Convention there, where we fought the police, and I got arrested, and then in 1971, we tried to stop the government during May Days in Washington, where if the government won't stop the war, we'll stop the government was the slogan, and the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, being led by Ron Kovic, who had a Medal of Honor and lost his legs in Vietnam, and John Kerry was part of that. We presented a peace treaty to Washington, and we said if Washington wouldn't accept the peace treaty, we would stop the government. And I went to Washington to stop the government, and I was arrested for freeing a prisoner and jumping a police officer. I went to maximum security, and when I got out, I didn't show up for my grand jury indictment, and I became a federal fugitive. And I was living in the mountains in Colorado.
Now, tell us about your awakening that you started on your path with. How did this start for you exactly?
Well, I'm a federal fugitive. I'm in the mountains, and I've got guns, I've got dynamite, and I'm torn by how do I take a life in the name of life. On the one hand, I feel totally one with my brothers and sisters in Vietnam who are being blown up, with genocide being committed in my name with my money. And my whole life, I couldn't bear being a good German, being someone who stood and watched as my government annihilated people. And now here I was, being in the role of a good German, watching as my country did a total annihilation on an innocent people. And it tore me up. If I'm one with them, I should be shooting down the bombers. And yet, how do I take a life in the name of life? And this became like a mantra. How do I take a life in the name of life? And it started a deep questioning in me. And it started, I was facing death. I mean, my cabin, the surveillance people were starting to show up in the road of my cabin. I was paranoid. I was afraid. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to hurt anybody. And yet I knew I had to do something. And so in that dilemma, I fasted for 3 days. And after fasting, I took 500 micrograms of LSD, of Owsley's window pane acid. And I experienced my death in that cabin. And as I died, I woke up. And I realized that the whole purpose of life is to wake up and to be free. And when the whole world disappeared, when I went through my death, there was nothing left but consciousness. And I know from that moment on, without doubt, that I am consciousness. I am pure immortal consciousness, and we all are. And that if we all realize this, the suffering would stop, the madness would stop. That I couldn't stop the war with guns, but I could stop the war with consciousness. And this became my goal. That was January 19th, 1972. And that started my spiritual search. And I went through the whole spiritual field. I mean, that was the beginning of the whole spiritual scene in this country. After the acid came the gurus. And I checked them all out, but none of them were transmitting freedom. And it took me 18 years from that date to the date when I met my teacher, exactly on January 19th, 1972 to January 19th, 1990. I found my teacher in India, and that ended my search.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book, when you talk about the teacher, the right teacher comes before you usually, but it's at a time when they're really showcasing or showing you yourself, so to speak, and what you need to learn.
Is that a question?
I was trying to think of it through and reading your book how you actually said that, so I didn't kind of trip it off in the wrong direction. But it was about the right teacher comes before you at the right time, but it's more of a reflection of where you're already at, so to speak. They don't really give you something, in other words.
Well, somebody once asked my teacher, why are there so many false teachers? And he said, because there are so many false seekers, and everybody needs a guru.
Right.
And so it's really not that you're a false seeker, but that there are different levels of consciousness that we go through, and each stage has teachers. So some people never leave the stage. So you may start, when I started out, I wasn't looking for enlightenment or freedom. I was looking for magic. I wanted to know, how do we change the world to stop this madness? How is it that greed is running the world and destroying it? How do we stop that? And I thought the only way was with magic. So the first teachers I found were brujos and magic people. And it took me years of my own evolution and refinement. And then I got to the Buddhists, and I got to the Sufis, and I got to the different layers and levels of my own being that were reflected in the teachers that appeared, until finally I was ready for my final teacher. And when I was ready for my final teacher, I was ready. I'd given everything else up. I just knew I needed somebody more awake than I was that could transmit this to me. Mm-hmm. And there he was. He showed up. I found him. I had to go on a search. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew that he was out there somewhere. And I found him.
Mm-hmm. Now, most people who are actually seeking to be awakened or enlightened really just want a better dream, as you were describing in your book. Why do we tend to lean in that direction?
Well, because we're all born into an identity as an ego. Mm-hmm. And it's a great survival mechanism. Ego is it's what made us survive and thrive. If you didn't have an ego, you didn't make it. So we are the children of the children of the children back for 1 million years that had ego. As soon as the language arose, so maybe that's 50,000 years ago, once there is language, there can be the sense of I. And once there's a sense of I, this becomes the software upgrade for the brain that becomes the new operating system. I is the operating system of the brain that says, I am in charge, I am in control, I know, I should do this, I want to do that. What a power. It's the greatest power of mind. And in that power, it's created this world that has enormous, mind-blowing capacity of discovery and scientific advancement, and the horror that we've destroyed the world. And so in destroying the world, we can blame the ignorant, greedy people. But ignorance and greed is at the root of ego. And so this ego that we call, and forget the word ego even, just say me and mine. This is the operating system, I, me, and mine. And as long as there's an I, me, and mine, it's run on survival and fear of death. And as long as fear of death and survival are running the machine, then this is what runs the ego. And the result of that is you see the destruction of the environment. You see we have so much power now that we've destroyed the world. Mm-hmm. So the ego was so successful up to a stage, but now, as it's creating its own destruction, it's ready for a metamorphosis. It's ready for the next evolution. The next evolution is to grow up out of the ego, Not that the ego is bad or wrong, it's functional. It has a place in the world, but now it's time for the flowering of a consciousness that transcends ego. Just like we have 3 brains in our bodies. Our first brain is the reptilian brain. It lives at the base of our skull. We've had that brain since we were reptiles. And now that brain controls our body temperature, controls our breathing, controls our blood pressure. It's an essential part of the brain. But we've grown beyond it. So the ego, essential part of the software, but now it's time for a software upgrade. So you don't kill the ego, you realize what it is and you grow beyond it. You realize who you are without an ego, beyond the ego, before the ego.
Now, I like the story that you share about Adam and Eve and their expulsion from paradise. It reminded me of a guest that we had on the program about a year ago, I guess it was, who was writing a book called The Genesis Code. And she was describing in the book that really the book of Genesis there's a Hebrew code that you really come to know, to where it really describes what's happening, which is more of the development of the human mind. As you were talking about, that we start off the survival mechanism of the reptilian brain, but then our brains begin to evolve to the point that we could understand reason, language, and the like. And it was really fascinating how she was sharing that view, of the Bible, and I started wondering, how metaphorical is this book that everyone reads and seems to believe that it's the absolute truth of what's going on here, or was it really just a book, of lessons of how we can come to, be awake, so to speak?
Well, it has nothing to do with awakening. The Bible was written as a way of maintaining control. I mean, you have to understand the historical context that the Bible gets written in. Mm-hmm. So at that time, Judea rebelled against the great empire of the world, which was Assyria. And so Assyria took the ruling class of Judea back as captives into Babylon. The rest of the people living in Judea were given the best farms, the best land, and allowed to continue their life. When these people got taken out of Judea and now they're captives in Babylon, how do they keep their life going? Because every civilization at that point, every city has at the center of the city a temple. And in that temple is where God lives. And so every Babylon has its God living in the center of its city. Every city, Nippur, whatever you name, the cities that were there at that time, each one was built around a place that had a house where God lived. Now, these Judeans, the house of God has been destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and that's a sign that God doesn't like you and he's left. So they've got to have a new mythology that they have to create. And so they have to create this mythology that God just doesn't live there, God lives everywhere. And then they build this story. The Adam and Eve story actually comes out of the tradition of, all of the Bible comes out of the Babylonian tradition. The Tower of Babel is actually a reflection on the ziggurat, which was the center of the city of Babylon where they were captive. So all the mythology that you get in the Bible is actually much older. Noah's story, the story of the flood. The story of the flood is actually 2,000 years older than the Bible. So the amazing thing is, when the Bible is written, there was no Hebrew. There was no written language of Hebrew. There was no alphabet. The alphabet also comes out of Babylonia. And it starts out with the local people on the street, because Babylonia was a literate culture for 2,500 years. They've been writing in cuneiform. And here's another good joke. So because the Babylonians were writing in cuneiform, which means pressing marks into clay, which then become hardened and last, so that we have the cuneiform libraries from 3,000 years ago. Because of that, and because there was no written Hebrew, when Moses comes down from the mountaintop, what's he carrying? He's carrying 2 tablets. Those are cuneiform tablets. And the joke is, of course, that Hebrews at that stage with Moses, which turned out is a mythology, but if there were Hebrews at that stage with Moses, they couldn't read it because it was written in cuneiform. There was not a Hebrew alphabet at that point. So the Bible is all made up. It's all a story. And it's a story in order to bind together a group of people who no longer had their central identity because their temple was destroyed. So even here's another good joke about the Bible. Purim. Purim is the celebration of Esther and Esther's father, Mordecai. Now, these seem like two very, very Jewish names, Esther and Mordecai. But it comes out of a Babylonian novel. And Esther is actually Ishtar, and Ishtar is the goddess Isis. And Mordecai is actually Morduk Kai. Kai means life in Hebrew, Chai. Morduk is the god of Babylon. So Morduk Kai is a Babylonian god, and Ishtar, Isis, is Esther. So we have Mordecai and Esther, the two quintessential Jewish names, actually are Babylonian names, and the whole story is made up based on a Babylonian novel at the time. So the whole thing is made up. It's a joke if you look at the history of it. So forget it. And so somebody from Israel once asked me, why is there so much Jewish guilt? And I said, well, you know, if you consider how many Muslims are there in the world, billions of them. How many Christians? Billions of them. And they're all following a false god made up by the Jews. How could you not have guilt?
You know, and it's fascinating, too, that you see so many people, millions around the world, who take it as, you know, that the Bible, you know, is sort of the final word, and then they hold on to that to the point that there's even people who are willing to kill. We've known this throughout the generations, to hold on to a belief. And I remember there was a time, again, another guest on the show, and we came to a particular time in the interview where I said, you know, I find it interesting that the more unsure a person seems to be about a belief, the more heavily they'll defend it, because of the fact that if they really realize that they're wrong, that could devastate them, and you can see how the ego can be into play in this particular situation.
The ego uses belief. So to wake up and be free is the willingness to leave all beliefs behind. Every belief. The belief of who you are, what you are, where you are, the belief of what's real, it's all a belief. We know that from science. We know that everything you look at that you call real, if you look at it closely enough, it's empty space and it disappears. We know that scientifically, but we live in the belief that it's real. We live in the belief that I am this body and I am Eli and you are. It's like that belief never gets questioned. And on top of that, we build these trivial false beliefs of religion, which are just mind traps. So to free ourselves from all belief, you can find what's real. Reality does not need belief. You only need to believe something or have faith in something if it's not there. So if you don't know and you have faith, that's dreaming. You don't need faith and you don't need dreaming and you don't need belief to find what's real. All you need is your own inquiring mind, your own native intelligence. Everyone who hears this, we are the same. We have the same consciousness. We have the same intelligence. And we have the same capacity to turn that intelligence away from the outside and towards the inside. And when you're willing to look in instead of looking out, you find everything that you've been avoiding on the inside is the first thing you meet. You meet all of your stories. You meet all of your emotions that you haven't met before and that you're running from. You meet everything in deeper, deeper layers until you get to the very core and the very bottom. And then this awareness turns to face itself and wake up and to see consciousness facing consciousness. This is like if you're in a movie theater, you're looking at the movie, but you want to find the truth. You have to turn away from the movie to look back behind you at the projector. And when you turn away from the movie to look at the projector, all you see is light. That's what happens as consciousness turns towards itself. It sees the light of its own nature. Mm-hmm. And this light, when it shines out into the world, projects out a story and a movie and believes it and lives in it and dies in it. But the possibility for us now is to stop the projection, to stop the beliefs, to stop everything, to find what's real, to find out what if you're not this body, what if you're not a son, what if you're not a daughter, what if you're not a mother or a child, what if you're not a parent, what if you're not a partner, What if you're not your job? What if you're not your relationships? Then who are you? And this is terrifying for the ego, because the ego says, well, then I won't exist. And yeah, that's right. The ego only exists in that game of that mirage. But to stop, to look inside, to find the truth, and to be liberated, oh, that's the meaning of life. That's the point. Then the countless millions of incarnations that took place in order for us to have this moment of life, they all make sense now. They all have meaning because you've realized yourself. They all led to that. If they don't lead to that, then it just leads to another round of more babies that maybe they'll realize themselves. No, there's not even a question of that. More babies, and hopefully you'll be happier than I am, and then I die. Mm-hmm. That's what life has been about. If you survive, you have babies, and you die. Mm-hmm. And then the babies grow up, and they have babies, and they die. For what? For what? The purpose of life, the meaning of life, is to know yourself, is to wake up and know the truth. And it's not a casual affair. The problem with our whole spiritual subculture is that it has it as a belief. I believe we're all one. I believe I am God. I believe I am emptiness. I believe I am silence. Whatever the belief is, it may be true as a fact, but as a belief, it's a lie. And so the possibility is to know for yourself beyond belief. And that's why we're here. And that's why I'm speaking to you today.
Mm-hmm. Now, it seems that many of us go through life seeking approval, security, or control. Those seem to be ego manifestations. Would that be the right way to look at that?
Yes, exactly. Those are the stages of ego. Every ego believes it should be in control because it's about my survival, and nobody else should have a choice over my survival. I have to be in control. And so I have to be in control of myself and of everybody who's around me. I have to be in control of my partner, my children, my job, my work. Wherever I can, I have to be in control because I should know what to do. And that's another terror of the ego is, what should I do? Most people are terrified of having the wrong answer and doing it wrong, and what do I do? And so I've got to follow somebody else who tell me what to do, or I've got to know enough to know what to do. But that's all the illusion of the egoic mind that thinks it's in control and thinks it knows what it should do.
It's so fascinating what you say there because of how often I'll see replies to radio shows or people inquiring into the website where they say, you've got a lot of great information here, and it seems to me that I'm kind of afraid to pursue some of this because I'm worried that I might do it wrong. And we tend to see that a lot in our society today where people have surrendered their personal power, if you will, to other people who are actually at times saying, no, you're really not doing it right. These are supposed to be the people who are allegedly helping us on our way to be better than we are. And then the question becomes, what made you decide that you needed to be better than you are at this particular moment? What led you to that?
So, my teacher would say that there's the sheep and shepherd game.
I like that part of your book, actually.
And most people are content to be sheep, to be led, to be told what to do, to be told what's right, to be told what God is, to be told that when they die they're going to go to heaven and they'll meet everybody who they left behind. All kinds of crazy stories that people are willing to believe to comfort themselves because of the terror of the uncertainty of death and the unknown. And this terror of the uncertainty of death and the unknown keeps us running as fast as we can towards something else. And this is what keeps the sheep and shepherd game going. There's plenty of people willing to be sheep and plenty of shepherds willing to tell you what's right and what's wrong, what you should do and shouldn't do, and how to get into heaven. And so my teacher is a lion. And he said, lions don't play the sheep and shepherd game. They roar. They roar, I am free. I am alive and I am free. And you too are a lion, and you too can wake up and realize I am alive and I am free.
Which brings me to security. As you were saying, a lot of people tend to be sheep. As I was describing to my wife at one time, I said, well, you got to take a look at the natural tendency of the human. We tend to be herd creatures. We tend to want to be in groups. That seems to be an instinct of ours. but we're also one of the rare animals that also knows that we can become independent, lead our own path, and we can survive outside of the herd on our own, unlike, let's say, a horse, for instance. They break from the pack, and they're in a lot of trouble because that's a survival mechanism. And so the question becomes then, how do we transcend that need for security to be able to find that way, so to speak?
When we were on the streets of Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, and I was an 18-year-old kid, and I was terrified, we sang a freedom song. And the freedom song was, I'm not a good singer, but bear with me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. Go home to my Lord and be free. It takes that kind of willingness, that before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. You have to be willing to not live a slave life anymore. So there's terror in that. Terror, how will I survive? How will I survive if I break free of my slave condition? It's unknown. The unknown is terrifying. So what we do is we project into the future an imaginary known. But it doesn't work. So finally, when you're fed up with being a slave, when you can't bear it anymore, when you must know the truth, then you're willing for whatever it takes. And when you're willing for whatever it takes, you have to face death. Because death is the great fear that all of us have. And if you're willing to die before your body dies, you're liberated in this body. Because the body will die, that's for sure. Nobody gets out alive. Everybody will die. And we make believe it's not now, we've got time, we don't know when. But instead of that, if you bring it to this moment and say, okay, if I die in this moment, what's my life about? What was worth living and what is worth dying for? So you bring it all back to this moment. And in that, it's terrifying to face yourself and to face the possibility of death, and to face the possibility of loss, the possibility of not knowing what to do, the possibility of not surviving. All of those terrors are there waiting to be met. And the great good news is when you meet them, you find that you are the transcendence of all of it, that none of them exist except for you. My teacher would tell a story of somebody who comes to cross the road for freedom, and they see a snake in the road, and they get terrified and turn back. And every day they come to cross the road for freedom, and they see the same snake, and they jump away and turn back. And one day, as they approach, someone comes from the other side, from the land of freedom, and says to them, "It's not a snake, it's only a rope." In that moment, you know it's not a snake, it's only a rope. You didn't have to fight with the snake, you didn't have to kill the snake, you didn't have to run from the snake. There was no snake, it was only a rope. This is what happens. I'm giving you the good news from the other side. There is no snake, it's only a rope. The fear of death, the fear of survival, the fear of what to do, the fear of being left alone, the fear of losing the herd, the fear of losing everything. It's just a mind disease. It's not real. It's a bad dream. Mm-hmm. And when you're willing to face it all, you wake up to find what cannot be lost, what's always already free, what's already love. See, when you find yourself and realize yourself as love, then you don't need love. You don't need to give love. You don't need to receive love. You are love. And when you overflow yourself as love, then you are loving. And then that loving, people drink from it. People come to be nourished by it because everyone loves love. And then it spreads from heart to heart. Love spreads. That's the possibility. Right now, fear is spreading. Fear spreads from mind to mind. And our whole society is based on spreading fear. From our government spreads fear.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of like if you will, the bully says, "I'm going to give you a reason to be afraid so that you'll need my services."
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's a protection racket.
Mm-hmm. Pretty fascinating stuff. I like, there was a part in your book that I wanted to read real quickly here that I think really sums up something that our listeners might come to feel an interesting sense of awareness and a possibility of what awakening can be like, and that simply is this. You say in here, on a deep level, consciousness is aware of the pain and despair of being trapped in a body, and this causes rage, fear, and self-hatred, the root emotions of all egos. Now, I remember reading that thinking, yeah, because we have this feeling that we could be free somehow, that we inherently know that this is true, but somehow it's a matter of how do we become untrapped, so to speak.
Yes, and so that becomes the driving motivation of the ego, to build heaven on earth. And we've been doing that now for thousands of years. We've built heaven on earth. I mean, we have miracles that, we can fly in planes. Go back 200 years and bring someone into an airplane, it would be magic. We have, everything, the internet, computers. It's all about trying to overcome that basic terror of and anger and rage about being encapsulated in this body when I know I can be free. And so now we just turn that energy from the outside to the inside to find what is already free. Because who you are is already free. You already are what you're searching for. You already are what you want to be. So you can't become it. You can't create it. You don't manifest it. All of that is just more mind activity searching to the outside. It's not in the future. It's not in the past. It's where you are in this moment. If you look deeply enough into yourself in this moment, you'll find the light of freedom. You'll find the purity of truth. You'll find overflowing love. Just by looking into yourself. And this is what we're all searching for. This is what brings a true heaven on earth. True love and peace between all beings.
One of the most fascinating awakenings I had several years ago, it seemed I was doing a series of interviews on the mind, the brain, and neurology. And as I was doing these, I started becoming aware of the fact that I've got this conversation going on in my head. And I'm starting to understand now that when I'm in particular moments, this conversation is loud enough that it creates a veil of which I experience that moment in a different way than it actually is. So when I was able to, it took some time to sort of arrest that. Say, hey, just knock it out for a minute. Let's just see what this is really all about here. I started feeling a sense of liberation and realizing that I felt more empowered than I had before when I was running on the mind and the constant chatter and the thoughts where I was enslaved by those. And I noticed that I started noticing it more and more, When is a moment going to present itself, for instance, that I might react to it? Whether it's positive or negative, either way I'm reacting to it rather than initiating action or allowing the action to unfold itself. And it took more and more time, but I started really becoming more curious about what is really going on with this mind. Where are these thoughts or these beliefs coming from that begin to veil me from having a direct experience with what's actually happening? And then I even further started examining or observing people around me as I would watch in their conversations, the beliefs, or wondering what the talk in their mind was going on that allows them to say and believe the things they believe. And it became really quite fascinating how often that occurs around us.
Yes, I'd say everybody's talking to themselves all the time, calling it thinking. If you're, it's like having a secret friend, a magical friend inside that you can always have a conversation with.
Right.
And the possibility, as you've discovered so beautifully, it's incredible that you've discovered this possibility to turn off the conversation, to have a quiet mind. When your mind is quiet, you're open. When you're open, you can receive. When you can receive, the quieter you are, the more subtle you notice what's arising, whether it's your own internal thoughts or what's happening in the environment. So the quieter you are, the more intelligent you become. The quieter you are, the more perceptive you are. The quieter you are, the more finely tuned you are into your own resonance of being. The quieter you are, the more love is able to express itself through your form. The quieter you are, the more intelligence shows up, because there isn't this barrier of the veiling, as you so beautifully said, of this talking in your head. Because as long as you're talking to yourself, you're missing what's going on. because you can't be in two places at the same time, and as long as you're talking to yourself, you're missing the moment that you're commenting on. And so this is one of the great, great benefits of a silent mind, is that it opens the heart, opens your awareness. It gives you the possibility to live a life without the commentary.
Mm-hmm. Just yesterday, in fact, I was out downtown, and a gentleman steps off of the bus, and he's got a cello and a really nice carrying case, but, it's a big instrument. And I decided to sort of make a lighthearted joke about, seems it might have been easier if you were playing the flute. Yeah, little harmless joke there, I guess. But he looked at me pretty aggravated for a minute, looked me up and down, and he says, someone like you would say something like that. And so I could sense that from his voice he was not only really irritated with what I had said, but the fact was is he was really going to let me have it as though he had been hearing this probably all day from everybody. And so then he continued on, and to just pretty much say, it's people like you that just really don't have anything useful to say, so you have to say something like that. And I just stayed there quiet as he was just letting me have it, right? And I said, well, I didn't realize that was going to offend you so badly, so I apologize for saying that. It's a nice instrument. And he says, well, I really appreciate that, but, and I don't remember what he said after that. And I thought to myself, maybe if I had spoke through the heart instead of being a smart aleck, I could have said, what is it like to play an instrument like that, and do you play for the symphony? It could have been a totally different conversation, and I have the freedom to do that. But
yes.
That he was so caught up also in the fact that he had been hearing, I must have heard 200 people say that to me this week, and he was just really this frustrated young guy. And I thought, okay, it's sort of like I was thinking at that moment when you break your arm or your leg or something like that, somebody, so what happened there? Tell me how you did that, as if it really matters that you need to hear the story.
Yes, exactly. So I love what you said, that you actually had a choice point. Mm-hmm. Instead of, doing this flippant joke, you could have actually connected with him in some way. And then, whatever his response is has nothing to do with you. It's like, you don't take it personally. If he's a madman, he's a madman. He doesn't have to be enlightened and free.
Right.
He can be just as he is. And you can just approach him with love and kindness. And you see, the flippant jokes, I remember at one point my partner said to me, you're so negative. I said, really? I don't think I'm negative at all. I think I'm pretty positive. And so then I said, so tell me, show me a time. And I would make a sarcastic joke, and she'd say, that's negative. I said, no, that's funny. And then I had to examine it and see that actually what I was calling funny was funny to me, but it was sarcastic, and the sarcasm was negative.
Right.
So I started to I made a mark on a piece of paper. I wanted to count how many times I was doing this. And the first day, I found like 8 or 9 times where I made a sarcastic comment that actually was negative, although I thought it was funny. And as I made those marks and recognized what I was doing, the next day it got slower and fewer, and then within a few days I stopped doing it. Not because I tried to stop doing it, but just by noticing it, noticing that pattern that was recurring. I didn't want that pattern. And just by noticing it, it stopped.
I went through the same thing in the kitchen, where I was going through a time where it seemed, as I was making dinner, that somehow inevitably something would happen and I would have a kitchen accident. Might spill the water or, drop the cake batter, whatever the case was. And I remember at first when that started happening, I'd be upset because now this was another step that I didn't anticipate, cleaning something up, for instance, and maybe even starting over. But in time, it got to be funny because I didn't know when it was going or how it was going to happen. So it became sort of like hide-and-go-seek, if you will. And I noticed that the more I was waiting for the incident to happen, the magical, mystical incident of making a spill, if you will, is that it just stopped happening. And it seems what's fascinating about what you're saying and what you talk about in Sudden Awakening, and I encourage people to really read this because you'll actually feel a change, and it'll be individual. I won't say it's going to be like that for everybody, but it will be individual. But the fact is, even in just being aware of your thoughts or just the conversation in your mind, you start stepping back into yourself and then seeing the outside world in a much different way, such as this celloist yesterday. I could have easily become just as irritated back with him by getting so upset with me over what was really a lighthearted joke, at least from my perspective, right? But instead I apologized, and I started thinking about that as I was on my way home, thinking, there was a moment that I could have actually changed and had a different conversation with this guy. That wasn't necessary to go the direction that I did. And I didn't react to it, which was the good thing, but I was trying to look at that moment that I felt a little bit hurt by what he was saying. Like maybe he overreacted. Oh, my goodness, why would you do that? But I didn't. In fact, it got to a point that I actually was very thankful for that mirror, if you will, reflecting back to me. Don't you think you could have maybe engaged me in a different way that might have been a lot more enjoyable for both of us?
Yes. It's so beautiful. But one of the most important things that you just said that really is so powerful is that when you were waiting in the kitchen for it to happen, when you were aware and not doing anything, but just aware of when is it going to happen, it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. That to me is the same thing with when your mind is quiet. If you're watching for where the next thought arises from and you don't touch it, it won't arise. And this is the secret of the silent mind, which has been the rarest thing in our species. So you did it. You've got it. You watched for the next mess up in the kitchen and it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. If you watch for the next thought arising and you don't touch it, also it won't happen. And in this, then your mind gets quieter and clearer. And as you said, the world changes around you. You start to see things in a whole new light. Mm-hmm. So beautiful. I'm so glad.
Yeah, and you also realize that you have a lot more choices, too.
Yes.
Even in places where people say, well, it didn't look like you had much of a choice, you really have a lot more choices than you think you do.
Yes.
Must be fascinating for people who come to learn from you or at least listen to lectures, realize the simplicity of what you're talking about here, isn't it?
Yes. People always say, it's so simple, it's so simple. And it is. What could be more simple than doing nothing at all?
It's like Fukuoka and his permaculture. I don't know if you're familiar. Are you familiar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
And he says the exact same thing, that here he simply stepped out and realized how perfect nature was as it was, that we could just simply maybe guide things in the direction we would like them to go, but just allow it to do what it already knows how to do. It's sort of like, what is it, the Bruce Lee quote, having no way is way, which even his own wife says a lot of people became very confused about what he meant by that, but, it's really that simple, though.
It is. It's not, and people confuse simplicity with ease. It's not necessarily easy. It takes enormous willingness to be simple. It takes enormous willingness to not go along with the crowd, to not follow the next thought. Because thoughts are empty. They have no inherent meaning. And when your mind is silent and still, it's the simplest of all. But as soon as you follow the next thought, as soon as you follow that into another conversation with yourself, you're back in confusion, you're back in unclarity, you're back in uncertainty, and the horror of a bad dream reappears.
Mm-hmm. Do you suggest meditation to people?
Sure, why not?
Sure, I just wondered about that.
Why not? I mean, what else are you going to do? Meditation is good for you on so many levels. It's like there's so many different kinds of meditation, and they all have different possible ways. They won't lead to liberation. They won't lead to a silent mind, but they're useful. It's better than hanging out in a bar. Mm-hmm. It's like yoga. It's like there was a time when yoga was only used for the transcendence of the body, to wake up. Now yoga is used as a worship of the body, and it's become super popular because of that. Well, that's fine with me. I think it's great that everybody's doing yoga. Why not? I mean, that could be the gateway drug in to find something that's more meaningful. Mm-hmm. So, it's all useful. Everything's useful.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of a documentary I've seen on the great chess champion Bobby Fischer. And the parents were concerned about him being obsessive about playing chess, so they went to a psychologist about that. He just simply says, There are worse things your son can be obsessed by than chess.
Yeah.
Now, tell us, I know that you're involved in what is known as the Leela Foundation. Tell our listeners more about what that is.
Well, that's the organization that supports my teaching around the world. So, we have retreats. My next one's in Germany. I go to Germany in a few weeks for a month, and then I'm in Australia in December, in Maui in January. So for your listeners, January would be the next U.S. retreat, and it's a time to come together to realize the truth and wake up.
Now, do you see in your experiences being around the world a lot of encouragement that we are moving toward a more peaceful way of life?
As the world is being destroyed, this consciousness of liberation is growing, and it's amazing to me. When I first started teaching in the 80s, nobody had even heard of a silent mind or stopping your thoughts. When I first started teaching in the 80s, nobody was even about waking up. Then it became about waking up. But now I see that there's people all over the world that have had deep experiences, spontaneously, with teachers, just through life itself, that people are having profound awakenings and are staying true. And I see young people so beautifully waking up. It's amazing for me to see this. So I love it. And my teacher, when I found him, I'd never heard of satsang before I found my teacher. And I'd been in the spiritual scene since the 70s. So from the 70s until 1990, I'd never heard of satsang. And when I found my teacher, he was a secret teacher. He was back in India, and nobody knew about him. And his function was to spread satsang around the world. And I supported him in that, and I brought my wife to him, and he named my wife Gangachi, and she supported him in that. And now, every country I go to, there are satsang teachers, and there's people who have had satsang, people who sat in satsang. It's mind-blowing to me, the number of people in just a short time that satsang has spread around the world. And when I say around the world, I mean Africa, Asia, Europe, North and South America, Australia, New Zealand. There's satsang. That is mind-blowing to me. Mm-hmm. So it's a race against time, We're waking up and we're killing the planet. Killing the planet has a big head start, so we'll see how it ends.
Certainly so. First of all, Eli, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us here on the program today, talking about your book, Sudden Awakening, How You Can Stop Your Mind, Open Your Heart, and Discover Your True Nature. Is there a website people can also find out more besides the Leela Foundation?
Well, the Leela Foundation is it, so it's leela.org, Leela.org.
Very good. Any final thoughts to our listeners?
It's possible to wake up and be free, and this is your time. If you're hearing these words, your parents never heard these words, their parents never heard these words, but you are hearing the words that it's possible for you to wake up and be free, and that all beings wake up and be free.
And I also believe it's your responsibility to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Eli, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You bet. Again, the book is Sudden Awakening. Stop your mind, open your heart, and discover your true nature. One thing you can discover is more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, and we'll certainly have links there for you to follow as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, live your day past halfway.